Hey, welcome to BJJ Mental Models, episode 12. I'm Steve Kwan.
I'm Matt Kwan.
BJJ Mental Models is your guide to a conceptual and intelligent BJJ approach. Today, we're going to be talking book club.
Yeah, we're going to be discussing The Art of Learning by Josh Waitzkin.
Yeah. And if we seem a little bit slower than usual, it's because we just had a gigantic dinner.
I'm going to try really hard not to vomit during this podcast.
Yeah. We might take a nap and pause and then come back and record a part of it later. So the Art of Learning, we've referenced this in earlier episodes, but there is enough content in that book that's relevant to the mental aspect of a strategic game like jiu-jitsu that we thought it would be good to just have a conversation about the book itself. There are a lot of mental models in the book that actually led to the direct creation of content that we put on our website. It also, for me anyway, gave me some insights into strategic thinking for jiu-jitsu and some of the techniques and principles that I can use in jiu-jitsu, particularly when it comes to the mental game and the mental side of things. For those who aren't familiar with Josh Waitzkin, the author of The Art of Learning, he is an interesting character. He's a bit of a Renaissance man. So he's originally most famous for being a chess grandmaster at a very, very young age. In his very, very early childhood through to his teens was a chess grandmaster. He was the inspiration for the movie Searching for Bobby Fischer. And in the book, he talks about that experience as well as talking about how having that kind of fame affected him and affected his enjoyment of chess. This is something that, he used to really love, but of course the situation changed for him quite a bit once he started to get world-renowned success and he kind of developed a bit of a fan following. He interestingly didn't just stop there. He went beyond that and became a competitive Tai Chi practitioner and world champion after he moved past into his early adulthood. What's interesting though is that I did not know that there was such a thing as competitive Tai Chi.
It's called push hands.
Yeah, so apparently it is a thing. I actually looked up one of his matches. I wouldn't say that it's the most effective self-defense or most effective martial art in a self-defense standpoint, but it is something that actually apparently does exist. So it kind of looks sort of like no-gi aikido or something.
A lot of engagement phase grappling.
Yeah, basically like if you think of like what a judo fight looks like, think of what that would look like without the gi, and then think of what that would look like if all you could do was kind of grab the guy's hands and forearms. And that's basically what push hands, at least to me, looked like. I mean, I have no experience in this particular martial art, but that is kind of what it appeared to be. It was kind of interesting because it looked like two guys just sort of grabbing each other and then spinning around in circles like an airplane until someone fell over.
Yeah, it doesn't look as dynamic or as maybe diverse as a sport like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but definitely there's aspects of kazushi and balance and taking momentum and center of gravity from your opponent and using it against them. So definitely, not exactly my favorite choice for self-defense art, but it's very interesting, and he illustrates it very well in the book as he goes on to describe multiple matches that happen and goes into great detail about the actual the physics of what's going on during the match. And of course, he's a black belt under Marcelo Garcia, and I believe one of the owners of his school in New York.
Yeah,
if I'm not mistaken.
This is something that kind of surprised me because he only makes very brief mention of jiu-jitsu in the book.
Yeah, spoiler alert.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he doesn't talk a lot about Brazilian jiu-jitsu in the book.
Yeah, he does. He did mention that at one point, and that got me thinking, man, it's interesting that this guy trains jiu-jitsu because that's not the reason I started listening to this thing. So I looked it up, and yeah, sure enough, he is a black belt under Marcelo Garcia, and he is one of the founders of the MG in Action website. So he's actually like one of the main guys behind the online academy. So he's an interesting character because this is a guy who's achieved, world-class levels at three completely different things. So regardless of, what you think of any of those particular avenues of expression, it takes a certain type of person, and in particular, someone who is exceptionally good at learning to be able to transition from one thing to another and reach that level of success. Most people never get that far at any one thing in their lives, and here's a guy who's kind of done it at three different times. So in this book, he talks about the strategies that he's used to rapidly learn and to absorb that knowledge and to build like the mindset of a champion. Now, in the previous episodes, we've talked about a lot of mental models that are either similar or directly inspired by his work. Today, though, we wanted to give the book proper credit and discuss in detail what he talks about in the book, and maybe hopefully encourage some people out there to go out and read it. It's actually a really interesting read, and Josh goes really in depth in the mental game. So if you've appreciated or enjoyed the last few episodes about the mental side of jiu-jitsu, you'll probably like his book a lot. And most of the people I know who have read it have said the same thing.
Yeah, I actually read this book on your recommendation, Steve, and it was really interesting for me, comparing my own journey in culinary arts as well as Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Josh's journey in chess growing up, and how, he's just really obsessed with it. Spent a lot of time playing chess in the park. I believe grew up in New York, and playing against all the old veterans in the park and gaining tons of experience that way. He talks a lot about not only his successes but a lot of his failures, and it's good if you're an aspiring athlete, or if you're just good at what you do and you want to become really, really excellent at your whatever art that it is that you do. Listening to someone's trials and tribulations and then using it as a reference point for your own journey. And, of course, the mental models that he utilizes that we talk about so much during this podcast.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch this guy go through the different phases of his life as well, and the different sports that he's practiced, and see some of the similarities between them, especially when it comes to learning, and some of the things regarding body mechanics too. According to Josh, there's a lot it seems like there's a lot of stuff that's kind of applicable across these different practices. And that doesn't surprise me at all, because that's basically what mental models are supposed to be, right? They're supposed to be things that are universally consistent. They're the building blocks of learning. So if you get really good at these, you should be able to apply them across the board. Now, Josh uses very specific terminology in his book that I found kind of hard to get my head around. So, and you may have noticed this on our website too, and in our previous discussions. Like, he talks about mental models that he calls like numbers to leave numbers, or form to leave form, which is like a bizarre and super confusing name, but it makes a lot of sense to him. When we put our site together, we've tried to stick to names that are really just kind of easily understood, especially to jiu-jitsu people. But in the honor of Josh, since he innovated a lot of this, I've gone with most of the names that he's used, but we'll do our best to try to explain what those things mean and why he chose those names and how that relates to his personal background. So, in the book, when it starts off, Josh is talking about his childhood experience. And as Matt said, from a very, very young age, he kind of got obsessed with chess. He was playing it in the park, beating up the old guys at chess. And before you know it, he started getting some mentorship and started working on the competitive scene. And it sounds like, like a lot of people who really have that mindset and skill level and excel at that level, at the beginning, it's just super, super fun, and he loves it and he's super passionate. But then in the later chapters, he starts to talk about the various things that kind of disenfranchise him about it. He talks about like his first big deflating a loss. And he talks about, like really, really underhanded tactics that some of his opponents use, or things that took his mind out of the game. He talks about a lot of stuff like that. And he talks about the impact that his fame ultimately had on his ability to focus and on his enjoyment of the sport of chess. And then he kind of goes on after that chapter of his life to talk about, Tai Chi. He never really gets into jiu-jitsu, but presumably he would probably say the same things now that he did then.
Yeah, it's interesting, when you first start in whatever it is that you're passionate about, you love it because it interests you, and because, you see that there's a little bit of potential in you, so you just want to follow that passion and really get as good as you can and do something for the love. And then years later, you look back and there's a lot of things that maybe, for your job or whatever, you start becoming jaded about things, about the industry that you're in, and just listening to him speaking from experience, it's really interesting how he goes from such a young boy who loves what he's doing, and then he sees sort of the side of chess that he doesn't love so much, such as, like you said, foul play from people kicking him under the tables and distracting him, and things like that. But some of the experiences that one experience I really like is when he talks about how he loses didn't lose his first coach, but when he discovered that his first coach wasn't really the best coach for him. And that was an interesting thing for me in being a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu practitioner. When you first start Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, sometimes we get into the habit of thinking that our instructor is invincible, or that they know everything, or that that you have possibly that you're with the best possible instructor that you could be with. But then as you get a few years experience and you meet other people, you begin to realize how maybe that instructor isn't maybe at the time that was a great instructor for you because they took you to a certain level, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be the best instructor to take you to the highest level possible. And I found that really interesting. And also it really rang true for me because I've gone through several instructors in my life. And, if I had never gone to a new instructor and thought outside the box, I definitely wouldn't have reached the level of a competitor or instructor that I am today.
I think this is going to be a recurring theme, but one of the things that I'm seeing is a lot of what appears in Josh's book is very similar to the things that we've already discussed. And that's great news because the whole idea behind this project is to document the mental models behind Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. So if we're on the right track, it means that what we're talking about should be very similar to what other people say as well. Matt, we talked significantly about this in prior episodes where, there could come a time anyway where you outgrow your coach. And that does not mean that your coach is bad, or that there's anything wrong with your coach. It could be that things are great with your coach, but just they've given you everything they can give you. And to get to the next level, you need to go somewhere else. And Josh actually describes that particular situation in his book where he's got a coach and the coach is great. But at some point he realizes that he's got to really step it up and switch to another coach. And he talks about experiences with multiple different coaches and some coaches where the style just was not his style and there just wasn't a match there and he had to move on. And ultimately at the end of the day, I believe, I don't recall exactly how it goes, but he ultimately kind of finds the right coach for him. This ties into something we've talked about in prior episodes where it's easy, especially at the early levels of jiu-jitsu, to get really caught up in authority and to be kind of overly respectful of people because they're a black belt or they're a world champion or they're just really famous. But the reality is that none of those things mean that that person is a great coach. And even if they are a great coach, none of those things mean they're the best coach for you. If your coach has a very different way of thinking from what works for you and plays a very different type of game, even if you love the person, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the best fit for you. So you kind of have to separate people from the position that they occupy and not get overly worshipful of their level of authority. And you also have to understand that parting ways does not always mean that something went wrong, right? It could mean that things are actually going very, very good, but it's just time for you to move on to take the next step up in your jiu-jitsu career.
Yeah, and it's very important for your coach to not only understand and respect those decisions, but to identify what's going to help you for your game and give you the understanding that you need to go to the next level. Like I could, let's say I'm a really big jiu-jitsu fighter in terms of my stature and my game is very heavy, but then I have students that are, a lot smaller, and I just tell them to use pressure, right? Or something vague like that. It's not going to be super effective for a much smaller practitioner if they're just told to be really heavy, and adopt that style of top game pressure. For, everyone's different. I have to understand that people have different needs depending on their body type and what works for their bodies and what kind of style that they have. So it's very important as a jiu-jitsu instructor to be able to have, I want to say, almost a universal instructional style that will not rely on things such as attributes, but things that are more universally coherent within the principles of jiu-jitsu for everybody.
Yeah, it's, when you're teaching people, your objective should not be to make carbon copies of yourself. Your objective should be to give these people all of the tools that you have so that they can be the best version of themselves, right? Your goal should not be to like copy and paste yourself onto every single person in the club, because everyone is so different. And there are things that, might work obviously for some people. Like, for example, a big guy might have a very particular obvious set of moves that work better for him than they would for someone like me. But then sometimes there are anomalies, right? Like, I'm a pretty small guy. I do a lot of like high pressure techniques as well. And for some reason, a few of them work. So everyone is incredibly unique and different. And if you try to force your game and way of thinking onto somebody else, that's usually a sign that there's not a good fit there. And so, when Josh talks about this, he kind of goes into the pain of like getting to that point with his coaches and understanding that he has to move on, and then like finding, I think at one point in the book he describes this hard ass coach that he's got, who's got this very particular style, and he keeps trying to make it work with Josh, and it's just not happening because Josh's game is very different. Like, Josh kind of describes his style of playing chess as like wild and chaotic, and he's talking about this like kind of like hard ass coach he has that wants everything to be much more methodical and strict. And Josh eventually comes to the decision at the end of the day that he can't get rid of the things that have worked for him in the past. It's better for him to build on those rather than to arbitrarily throw out things that are working to appease a coach.
Yeah, and sometimes if you do end up in a situation where you have to leave a coach for whatever reason, like Steve was saying, it's not necessarily because things have gone bad. Last year around this time, I was being considered to be a black belt under my former coaches, and they were saying that, hey, we think it's time that you get your black belt. And I was doing really good with, if I was competing with black belts in a lot of no-gi tournaments at this time. I generally locally would hold my own with black belts, if not be, pretty successful with black belts. And then I talked to my current professor, Rob Bernacki, who's a great friend of mine and of course an amazing coach. And I said, hey, the guys are thinking about giving me my black belt. What do you think? And the first thing he said was, you're not ready. The first thing he said was, your guard is not good enough. And at first I was kind of taken aback because I was like, well, people rarely pass my guard. How can you say that? But then the more I thought about it, the more I realized that if someone was going to give me such harsh, straight up feedback that I wasn't used to hearing and it was uncomfortable to hear, I realized that was the type of person that I needed to follow, because he's seeing holes in my game that will make me a much better competitor at the highest level. Because like he said, who cares if no one locally can pass your guard? I want you to be able to fight the best in the world, and nobody can pass your guard. So that is why eventually I ended up going with Rob, because he had the foresight to give me that, that kind of a brutal reality check that, hey, you know what? Yes, you're good, but there's definitely things that can be worked upon. And in his opinion, I wasn't ready for the black belt. So that totally made sense for me. And, that pretty much made up my mind right there that I was going to go with Rob.
That's a really great example of a growth mindset, which is something that we talked about earlier, because a lot of people in that situation would completely shut down that conversation and say, well, you're wrong. I'm ready for a black belt. Someone else is going to give me a black belt, so I'm going to go get that black belt, right? And they kind of start to chase the rank there. A lot of people would do that, but a growth mindset is all about kind of, rather than looking for like, status symbols or attributes that you think are permanent about yourself, or, trying to build up your ego. It's about really looking for ways to improve, and you can always improve. And interestingly, we talked earlier about the research from Carol Dweck on the growth mindset that she discusses in her book on the topic. And I think Josh actually makes reference to the same research in his book as well. So he's kind of talking about the growth mindset in his work, and how it's important, rather than just thinking, oh, I'm great, to always be looking for ways to improve, regardless of how good you may actually be, right? It's not about how good you think you are. It's about every day looking for ways that you can improve and fix the things that are preventing you from being even better.
Exactly. We discussed this in previous episodes about, rather than, putting the world championship on a pedestal and, my goal is to win these championships or whatever. whatever. It's great to have those goals, but what goals can you set that will get you there one step closer every day? What habits can you create? And, how can you basically invest in your lifestyle that will make those long-term goals a reality over time, rather than always just making the end goal being, the world champion or whatever. So it's really important to think about everyday habits that can lead you to that, rather than, the big overall goal and put it on a pedestal.
Yeah. And another thing that we talked about briefly there, Matt and I have a saying, and that is do what works, right? It's very common for people to doubt themselves because they found a technique or a strategy that works for them that is unorthodox. And maybe people will poo-poo that strategy and say, oh, that's not good jujitsu, right? But ultimately, at the end of the day, the only thing that defines good jujitsu is it works against quality competition and it's fundamentally sound from a principles and an alignment standpoint, right? If you have a strategy and you can justify it using reasonable arguments and you have evidence that it works, it works. It doesn't matter if other people, even if very smart and intelligent people who know more than you, say it doesn't work, right? The reality is a lot of the time, people who are very experienced tend to kind of get their ego attached to things and they're resistant to new ways of thinking, as we've discussed in the past. So this is something that, I think is mentioned, and kind of there's a good example of that in the book where Josh, again, talks about how he eventually comes to realize that his style just might not be a style that his coach necessarily likes. It might not even be a style that is technically considered good. But if it's working, then you've got to find a way to develop on top of the skill set that naturally comes to you, rather than trying to arbitrarily throw things out to please your instructor, right? It's something to be very, very mindful of when you're looking for a good jiu-jitsu gym. There might be weird random things that you do that are technically not good techniques, but if you can do them safely and you have luck with them, then it's worth thinking about. I mean, I'm kind of pretty well known for this, right? I've got a lot of weird, bizarre, oddball techniques that aren't supposed to work very well, but they've always worked for me. And I've chosen to develop on top of those, even if they're a little bit different.
Yeah, and that's basically what jiu-jitsu is you use what works and you discard what doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And that is going to change for everyone depending on their attributes, their size, their style, whatever, who they learned from growing up in the sport. So, like you said, as long as it's fundamentally sound, and for me, conceptually, if it usually fits the alignment concepts and the guard retention concepts, then, I'll make a decision whether or not I want to absorb something new into my game or not. But, if someone's going to give me crap because I neck crank them from the back, but they still let me wrap my arm around their neck, and then they're telling me
they're hiding behind the rules.
Yeah, they're going to hide behind the rules. Well, I'm still going to crank your face off just because it's a legit move, right? Like, I mean, ultimately it is a martial art, and, if you are behind someone and you get that dominant angle and then you get them in a position where your arm is over their face, are you gonna not defend yourself because you can't get under their chin? No, that's not really a good enough defense to prevent me from cranking your jaw off.
Yeah, I actually want to talk about defensive strategies at some point in a future episode, because this is something that always kind of bothers me when people's chosen defense is to basically do nothing and hope the other person gives up. That is never a good defense, right? If your defense is basically to try to shell up and not try to escape the position and just hope that due to gassing out or the rules or boredom, your opponent just lets you go. Unless you're an armadillo or a porcupine, that kind of defense is probably not going to work effectively for you in jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, you perfect example would be Olympic level judo. Sometimes you'll be watching high level Olympic judo and someone gets thrown in it's not ippon, it's like a wazari, or they end up on their stomach, and then you see them just lie there and wait for the ref to stop it. And sometimes the person on top just gives up the position and stands up again, and then they begin back on the feet again. But a lot of the time they'll get caught off guard by somebody who has a little bit of newaza, and then they all of a sudden they're getting their back
they're getting their back
they're getting their back choked out, and they don't see that as a position of of extreme disadvantage under the rule set of judo. But really what you're doing is you're basically just giving your opponent a freebie. And it's an awesome thing to see someone get caught on their heels like that and lose, because it's, that's going to be a learning lesson from them, and hopefully they'll they won't just say, oh, well, I went against someone who was really good at jiu-jitsu, so that's why I lost, and make an excuse for themselves. It should, you should say, no, your mindset was that, you gave up basically, and you allowed them to take control, and that's why you lost the fight.
And that's another great example of a growth mindset, right? There are a lot of people, myself included, who, when they lose or things don't go their way, there can be a laundry list of excuses that are immediately provided as to why that happened. I see this all the time when something doesn't go their way in jiu-jitsu, and, is immediately out of their mouth, they list off all of the reasons why, and it's never anything that they did. It's always something that someone else did, usually the ref. And the reality, though, is that that's not a growth mindset, right? If you want to really, and it's also not extreme ownership. If you want to actually gain anything out of the experience, it doesn't matter whose fault it was, right? It doesn't matter why it happened. It's just, let's learn from this and let's make sure it doesn't happen next time. Let's use this as a platform and a stepping stone to get better, rather than just dwelling on it and gaining nothing from the experience.
Yeah, and I'll say this: I've done this before too, and you go into a tournament and then you lose by a point or whatever, and then after I hate points. I only want to do sub only or whatever, and then I've said that before, and then after I thought about it, I'm like, what, if I'm blaming the rules, it's not the rules' fault that I got outpointed by my opponent. You know what I mean? It's
you knew the rules going into it, right?
I knew the rules going into it. Well, actually, sometimes
you don't.
Sometimes you don't. They're always changing the rules. Like in the last tournament that happened last week in Oregon, I did the Naga and got gold there, and then I got bronze in the Portland Open IBJJF, and I got flattened on my back in the half guard, and I actually didn't know that was an advantage. Once the action disengages, your opponent gets an advantage if they flatten your back, because I just figured, I still maintained my guard. They didn't really pass the guard, they just flattened me, and then I got back. And I came up and almost swept them, and I thought that I did enough to put them. The actual rule is put them on their back or their butt, and then they pop up. You would get an advantage for an attempted sweep. But the match ended just as that happened, and I thought I was going to get my advantage, but instead my opponent got the advantage, and I was shocked because I thought I had done enough to get to the next match. I've seen people in tournaments where they think that they've been wronged or they made a mistake, and then they storm off and they start blaming the ref, or they'll make other excuses for their loss. But what I've sort of, I don't want to be like pump my tires or whatever, but I said to myself, what? Okay, what happened? I started asking the ref, okay, I'm not going to complain. I just want to know why he got the advantage and I didn't. And then he said, well, the half guard, he flattened you out in the half guard. And I thought about, what does he mean by that? Is that even and then I checked with the corner, I checked with a few of the coaches, and they said, yeah, that's a rule. Because I literally said, okay, wow, I didn't actually know that rule. So how can I blame the rule set when it's me who didn't have the perfect fight? So I said from there on, okay, well then what I've gained from this is I now know more about the advantage system, and I know more about how I can make adjustments to win in the future. I had to keep those grips and finish my sweep attempt by putting him on his back, and I certainly couldn't let him. I couldn't mismanage the distance and let him flatten me to my back. So it's going to be a lot more of a constructive experience in the end if you can take extreme ownership and say, okay, I'm not going to make excuses. I'm going to try and learn, and even though I lost, I want to take a positive out of this. Rather than blaming something and saying, oh, I hate the point system. Why do you hate the point system? Because you lost. What if you won? You'd love the point system. Or what if the point system worked in your favor? You would have loved it. So
yeah, it's It's interesting that you mention that, because there's, this is a situation where frustrations like that could have absolutely derailed you. But there's also the more insidious type of frustration, right? Like where your opponent is actively playing some sort of mind games with you. They're doing things to deliberately try to provoke a response. I've been to competitions where I've seen guard passing that actually is closer to punching the guy in the stomach. But, some guys will do stuff like that, or they'll do moves that are basically reaping the leg, but they've kind of positioned themselves in such a way that it's not obvious. Basically things that are intended to get an advantage by any means, and in a lot of cases to provoke a psychological response in their opponent. And especially in a lot of high-level competitors, high-level competitors tend to be the kind of people who are especially sensitive to this kind of thing. Josh talks a lot about that in his book, and he talks about how he's had these frustrations before, some of which are imposed by his opponents, some of which are nothing to do with his opponents, just aspects of his life. And he goes into detail about things that have frustrated him and taken his head out of the game, and how he's come up with ways to use those as motivations to get his head back into the game. Some of these examples that he gives will probably be very familiar to people who compete a lot. Like, when your opponent is doing like underhanded things, like trying to the example he gives is people trying to kick him under the table when playing chess. But when he starts going into competitive Tai Chi, he talks about how when he goes to and competes in foreign countries, and the foreign countries are obviously biased and stacking the deck towards the local guy, right? Which I think is something that everyone in jiu-jitsu can relate to.
Yeah, like not letting you know when your fights are, but the home team knows when their fights are happening.
Yeah, like all of this really dirty underhanded stuff. And he also gives examples of things that have nothing to do with his opponent. Like he has an interesting story about getting a song stuck in his head, and it got so distracting that it was actually preventing him from being able to play effectively. And the problem with a lot of things like that, right, is when you get a bad thought stuck in your head and your immediate reaction is to resist it and fight it, that always makes it worse, right? The example that a lot of people always hear is if I tell you don't think of a pink elephant, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to think of a pink elephant, right?
I just did.
Yeah. And he talks a lot about being able to turn these frustrations into motivating factors rather than using them as something that kind of takes him down the downward spiral. This, in a lot of ways, kind of ties into, and actually he talks a lot elsewhere in the book about the concept of mindfulness, right? Of rather than getting caught up and trying to fight these feelings and these emotions, even if they're reasonable feelings and emotions to have, kind of taking a step back and approaching them analytically and rationally and asking yourself, how can I use this as a motivating factor rather than as something that defeats me? The example he gives, for example, when he talks about getting a song stuck in his head, is eventually he just starts playing the game to the rhythm of the song. So yeah. when the song gets stuck in his head, he just starts getting pumped, and he just starts playing the game in momentum with the song. I thought that was a really interesting way to deal with kind of a very silly but potentially devastating, mental problem that you can have. It's a really interesting book if you find yourself susceptible to that kind of mental frustration, or you get caught up in these things a lot. He gives some very concrete examples as to how to overcome that.
Yeah, he also talks about Reggie Miller, in the NBA, who was I guess in the playoffs. Not only do I not know much about sports, but I don't know much about the NBA at all.
I don't know much about jiu-jitsu competition, so but at least you have an excuse for not knowing about the NBA.
Right. He basically says that Spike Lee is in the crowd, and he's Spike Lee, a very famous director, and he's Reggie Miller is playing against his team, and he's razzing Reggie Miller from the court side. And what happens is the attempts to throw Reggie off his game actually start working against him, and Reggie Miller just goes on fire, and
just to piss off Spike Lee.
Yeah, and uses it to fuel him, which is something that is very real. If someone's trying to, someone in the stands is trying to razz you, sometimes if you start to gain momentum as an athlete, you can start to use it against them and then make them look like a fool real quickly. So
sounds a lot like how comedians deal with hecklers, right? Is they basically just turn it against that person.
Turn it against them, yeah, rather than letting it affect their performance. So it's also really interesting hearing Josh talk about about that and talk about, these dirty tactics being used against your opponent. And it can happen. It's all a mental battle, right? It's as long as you don't let it affect you and get under your skin, you can totally use it against them and quite effectively and usually much more effective than what they're trying to do to you.
Yeah. It's really enlightening to see kind of how like a champion level athlete, kind of like what's going on inside their head and how they deal with these situations, both externally imposed and sometimes internally imposed, where these like frustrations boil up within them and how they kind of overcome them, like how they overcome the weaknesses of their own mind. Josh also talks a lot in the book, while we're talking about mindfulness, he talks about how like it's so important to stay in the zone and stay in the present moments, and because there are so many things that can rattle you, but if you're obsessed about the past or the future or what ifs, it's going to take your attention off of what needs to happen now. Matt, you were talking about an interesting example he cites in the book where he's getting all messed up during a game and then an earthquake suddenly happens, and that's enough to pull his attention back into the moment and get him back on track.
Yeah, I believe actually what happens was the earthquake gives him clarity. I believe it's a match in India he's having, and it's kind of I don't know if it's like a shootout in the match, and it's kind of everything's chaotically happening, and he can't really gather himself, and then the earthquake happens, and it kind of knocks some sense into him, and then they actually take a short recess to gather their thoughts or whatever, and after the earthquake, make sure everyone's okay or whatever, and then they come back and he knows exactly what he's going to do. So sometimes it can be a traumatic event or a specific event that can kind of give you that clarity that you need. And he also goes on to talk about recreating that, like creating a strategy to be able to recreate that trigger in your mind to essentially enter what he calls the flow state, and sort of reach your peak performance. And anyone who's done jiu-jitsu knows that what you're trying to do essentially is get into that zone where you're not really thinking, but you're more just acting upon reaction and relying upon your hours and hours of training to take you into that state where you have a really clear mind and you just focus on the task at hand. And a big part of what I got from the book was when he discussed how he would actually teach businessmen to set triggers and routines in their preparation so that they could go in and do a board presentation and already be in the flow state. He starts off by saying, okay, well, I like to listen to music for 20 minutes. Then I like to have a stretch for 20 minutes. Then I like to, I like to have a meal, and then, and then I'll go play catch with my son or something. And then I'm ready to go for the day. And it helps. And then when I do it enough times, the repetition of it all, when I do it enough times, I get into the zone without even thinking about it. And then what he tries to do is he tries to add distractions to it, or he tries to limit the time allowance for it so that on game day, if you do have other distractions and you need to adapt on the fly, or if you have less time to prepare than you would have expected, then you're gonna be able to overcome those obstacles. Like a prime example for me, again, I'll reference last weekend in Oregon, was you try and set yourself up as best as you can. So we got to the arena about an hour before we were supposed to fight, which was luckily early in the morning. And I hadn't eaten breakfast, which is something new that I'm trying. And I feel like it really helps me get into the zone by being hungry. And I feel a lot more flexible and malleable when I'm hungry and not bloated. But also I feel more awake and aware and ready to hunt. And I have a much sharper mind when I'm hungry. But I came in and I've never had to do this before. So it was quite interesting. Is I came in 2 pounds overweight when I jumped on the test scale about an hour before. So I had actually mentally prepared for this the night before and thought, okay, I think I'm going to be on weight, but I'm just, I'm going to go there. And if I am a little bit over, I'm going to be prepared to do what I have to do to make weight. So jumped on the scale. I'm 2 pounds over what I'm supposed to be. So like, shit, okay, I prepared for this. I'd already sort of expected this a little bit. So I had some sweats and I had a hoodie on. So I started running laps around the gym. I started doing burpees and getting good sweat. I also started spitting in a cup, which, you can shed a good pound if you keep spitting in a cup for a half hour. And then, I jumped on the scale half hour later and boom, right on weight. So not only did I gain experience from that and say, hey, you know what? You don't have to stress if you're a pound or two over. You can sweat that off the day before, and I know that now. But I was able to not let that affect my mindset going into the tournament. I wasn't getting flustered at all while I was cutting weight. I stayed relaxed. I said, just, relax. You're going to be able to get this weight off. It's just a distraction. We're going to adapt and we're going to be able to fight. We're going to make weight. We're going to do it. So it's, you could look at it two different ways. You can prepare for adaptation and, all the different factors that can happen on game day, which are a very real possibility, or you can let it totally stress you out, get your mind off of the actual fight. You're worrying, you're not where you need to be in a headspace, and you're getting stressed out. So it really comes down to mental preparation. And again, being able to set these triggers in your mind, if you're a high performance athlete, is going to help you really show up on game day. And if you're a competitor, that's really what matters. You can be the best guy in the gym, but if you don't compete well on game day, then that's, it's kind of all for naught in a way. So you want to be able to take yourself out of the distractions and make things happen when they matter.
Yeah, that, I think everyone has heard of flow, right? Basically the concept of like you can get into this peak performance state. There's an incredibly famous book called Flow that kind of exposed everyone to this research. I am not going to try to pronounce the author's name because it's super complicated and I will butcher it. But one of the things about flow is like, hey, yeah, it sounds great that we can get into this peak state. We've all been there, but how do you force that to happen when you need that? Like, how do you call upon that like a superpower? And one of the things that, you talked about, Matt, and one of the things that Josh talks about in his book is how to set up mental triggers and shortcuts so that you can get there. And I've heard of stories of guys who, like, in their meditation practices have practiced and built these triggers so that, they can completely defuse and de-stress themselves and kind of like bring down their emotional heat level just by taking a few breaths, right? Mm-hmm. If you practice that and set that as a trigger and build a routine around it, then you can kind of call upon this state on command. This is something that you can also use in the workforce world, right? Which is, where kind of I spend most of my time. There's a book I read recently called When. I think it's by Daniel Pink, although I might be wrong. And he's talking about kind of like when the ideal time is to do everything. And it's like, when's the right time to do this aspect of your life? When's the right time to do that aspect of your life? And one of the ideas he had, which I think is very useful if you're in like management or you're just dealing with difficult team situations, is you can use difficult situations as the opportunity to do a fresh start and do like a reboot. So, what you provided there, Matt, is kind of a similar example of where, there was a situation, a potentially difficult situation that could come up. You expected it and you kind of knew what to do when that happens and to go right into that. You can also use kind of crises or difficult situations as an opportunity to reset the playing field. And basically, and this is especially important if you're dealing with other people who have their egos invested in a project, or if it hasn't been going well, you can kind of say, okay, this hasn't gone well, just like clean slate, let's start from the ground up, let's forget everything we know, let's drop all of that emotional baggage behind us, and let's just kind of go like we're going from step one again. And that kind of mindset can help you kind of put all of that mental baggage behind you if you are in a really, really dire, difficult situation. Because the last thing that you want to do when you're stressed like that is be so stressed that you can't get into that flow state, because then it's going to be a lot harder to dig yourself out of that hole if you can't get into your peak performance mindset. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some other interesting things I noticed about this book, when he's talking about his chess career, he talks about different chess strategies, some of which are shockingly similar to things that you hear in jiu-jitsu. Like he talks about, I believe it's pronounced zhuzhuang. It's a German word that basically means like you put your opponent in a situation where doing anything is going to be disastrous for him. And he also talks about a strategy called prophylaxis, which basically means like just gradually and slowly strangling the life out of your opponent, right? And it's funny to hear these talked about in the context of a chessboard, because you always hear people talk about this in the context of jiu-jitsu, right? And it's just
this ideal.
Yeah, this exact same kind of strategy. So it's funny that, when you're not even doing anything physical, people can still employ the exact same types of strategies.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, going further into the book, where it really starts to kind of get relevant to jiu-jitsu is when Josh pivots and starts talking more about his Tai Chi career, because that becomes a lot more physical. And he's also starting from square one, right? He's gone from the situation where he was a world famous world champion to now being a nobody in a completely different sport. And we've talked in earlier books about investing in loss, and Josh goes really in depth in this mental model, especially once he starts getting into martial arts. He talks about how, he's at the beginning, he's just getting his ass kicked left and right, basically.
Yeah.
And honestly, if you're him, it's got to be pretty hard to keep going back to class the next day, right? Now, I get it. I get that Tai Chi is not like the most impact-driven martial art in the world, but still, right? Like,
although he makes it sound like MMA.
He does make it sound like it's like blood sport or something.
Yeah, he does.
Say. Now, I've never trained push hands, but it certainly doesn't sound as brutal as he... I mean, we're probably going to get hate mail now, but it certainly doesn't sound like it should be as brutal as he makes it out to be. But anyway, he talks about how, he's going from this situation where he's like this total hotshot, best in the world, to being just another, like, basically the equivalent of a first day white belt. And he tells stories about, like the big guys who kind of like, they always want to spar with him and they just kind of like beat him up mercilessly. But he talks about how he intentionally seeks out those training opportunities. Mm-hmm. And after getting defeated, dozens, maybe hundreds of times, he gets to the part where he starts picking up wins. And interestingly, around that time, those training partners no longer want to spar with him anymore, right? Which is something that a lot of people in jiu-jitsu probably can relate to. You always get benefit from training with people who are bigger and better than you. That's where you're going to see the most of your growth. But it's hard to do. It's really, really hard to put your ego aside and just like basically get into a situation where you're going to get your ass kicked and everyone is watching, and then come back and ask for more, right?
But generally, that's how you're going to accelerate a lot faster, is when you seek out those hard rolls. So, it definitely resonated with me, being a jiu-jitsu practitioner who always tries to just, get the hardest rolls possible. And that is really, going into your discomfort zone. That is where you're going to see the most gain. So if you're one of those guys that ducks people, or you like sticking to the lower ranked roles or certain people in the room because it's a comfortable role. And everyone, granted, has different goals. Some people just want to be recreational and just want to stick to the same people that they roll with. But if jiu-jitsu is something like, or whatever it is, if you want to become the best in your field, you have to make the most of your time, make every round count, and you have to really seek out the best training that you can.
Yeah. We've talked about growth from discomfort in the past, which actually is heavily inspired by a quote from Josh Waitzkin. In the book, one of the quotes he gives, which I think is fantastic, is growth comes at the point of resistance. We learn by pushing ourselves and finding what really lies at the outer reaches of our abilities. And that's basically, where you want to be in jiu-jitsu, right? You always want to be just a little bit outside of your comfort zone. And then once you get comfortable there, you take another little step outside of your comfort zone. And it's a never-ending process of kind of growing and expanding the level of things you are comfortable with, and then continuing to just go outside of that comfort zone. Mm-hmm. So in terms of some of the specific things that Josh mentions that can be a little bit confusing, he talks about this mental model that he calls form to leave form. And in other places in the book, he calls it numbers to leave numbers, which is a very confusing name. And it's very kind of hard. It took me a long time to kind of get my head around what he's trying to explain here. But basically what he's saying is that when you're doing something that's really like technically complicated, like chess or a martial art, what you need to do is you need to like drill concepts so heavily and so consistently that you don't need to think about them anymore. You're basically, what you want to do, is you want to take these like really, really advanced mechanical motions and move them to the point where you no longer need your conscious brain to be thinking about them, but you can kind of activate them at a muscle memory or a subconscious level. So a perfect example being like, I think we've talked about this in the past, but if you see an arm bar for the first time, you're probably going to sit down and someone is going to show you like 20 individual steps. to do the perfect armbar, and you're never going to remember it, right?
Yeah.
But if you drill that over and over and over again, I mean, you probably still aren't hitting the move in practice, but it's going to get to the point where you no longer need to actively think about those steps, and you no longer need to actively think about the principles behind them. They just kind of get ingrained into your muscle memory or into your subconscious. And then, next, maybe one day, someone can come to you, and when they say, hey, do what's an arm bar? You know what all of those steps are. You don't need to think of it as this like bag of like 20 steps that you have to remember individually. It's now been condensed into one word. It's arm bar. You know what the arm bar is, but in reality, it's this big complex thing. But once you can get ideas like to the point where they're in your subconscious and you can just think about them as a simple label and you don't have to think about them anymore, now you can use that as a building block for something else, right? Because now I can tell you, well, there's this thing called a flying armbar, or there's this thing called like an inverted armbar or a short armbar, and I don't need to take you all the way from step one all the way back up to this again, because you already know some degree of foundation as to what that is. So part of what he's talking about here when he talks about form to leave form, and the reason he gives it this name is because he's saying basically like you practice the form until you don't need it anymore, right? Like you practice it until it doesn't even exist. It's just like it's in the back of your mind now when you don't need to think about it. The idea is you take these big ideas and you train them until they become building blocks that you can then build on top of. And that's kind of one of his strategies for how he learns rapidly and picks up these new things, whether it be chess or Tai Chi or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu.
Yeah, and the same thing is true in cooking, for example. When you're learning all these techniques, there's infinite recipes and things that you can learn. That's why we break things down in cooking to things like ratios and things like, like in terms of sauce cooking, you want to have, you don't just cook every sauce from scratch. You usually create the 5 mother sauces, and then from those mother sauces, you have a variety of classical derivatives. So once you learn how to make the mother sauces, you essentially are able to make a variety of different derivatives of sauces. So it's the same sort of thing in jiu-jitsu where, if I can learn the concept of an armbar, which is just basically control of 2 ends of a lever with the proper fulcrum, which allows you to generate force, then you're going to be able to see that lever concept in different places. And this is also an example of something that we've talked about called incremental learning, where if I'm going to try and show someone, a bunch of different arm bars all at once, and they don't know what the main concepts are behind a regular classical arm bar, I got my work cut out for me. But if we can, show a little bit every day, and maybe the first day I show a traditional armbar and we drill that a bunch, and then you finally get that down, and then the next day we can add a little bit more onto that, and then the next day we can add a little bit more onto that. Then, before you know it, you've created these sequences where not only are you performing an armbar, but reactions to your opponent's predictable defenses. You understand the factors and things that can go on. You understand different setups and different angles and like you said, different types of armbars. So you're never gonna. You want to train, like you said, train yourself to have the basic, most basic fundamental principles of a certain technique or a concept, and then from there over time you can add on to it and use that as a platform to build a stronger understanding of the defenses, the what can go wrong, the variations.
And it's interesting because when you see like a black belt be exposed to a new technique for the first time, usually almost immediately, once they see that technique, they have assessed how, is this technique going to be effective for my body type? If not, what kind of modifications do I need to make to it to make it effective? What kind of variation should I expect? What should my opponent do? Like all of that stuff is so ingrained over years and years and years of training and repetition that you can kind of just pull it out of a hat. We just had this in class today where I saw some stuff for the first time that I hadn't seen before, and I was pretty able to easily assimilate into it. Like, how does this tie into the stuff that I would normally do? And what are all of the what if scenarios? And you don't need to think about it because it's just kind of right in your muscle memory and your subconscious, right? It's not like you need to pull all of those steps out and read every page of the book again. So, Interestingly, Josh, on the topic of incremental learning, he has a very similar mental model that he talks about, which he calls making smaller circles. And what he means by this is like when you're given a whole bunch of stuff to learn, like a new martial art, you should always prefer depth over breadth, right? So rather than trying to pick out 1,000 different techniques or variations or flashy combinations, right? You want to focus on the core fundamentals, like discard everything else, focus on really understanding the core fundamentals and perfect those. And once those are perfected, then you can start thinking about how to kind of grow and expand past that. So when he says making smaller circles, he's basically saying like if your circle of knowledge and expertise contains like 100 techniques you saw on YouTube, you want to kind of filter it, and you're actually better going micro rather than going macro and focusing on the core things. And even once you get down to like a single technique, like an armbar, for example, you don't need to necessarily even know all of the details of it. You need to know just the core fundamental mechanics. Like when Matt and I are talking about alignment and stuff, that's really what Josh is talking about here, like understanding the why of why this move works, right? And then from there, once you've got that mastered, then you can start worrying about all of the little details surrounding that. And that again kind of comes into the concept of incremental learning, right? You need to walk before you can run. And in the case of like an arm bar, you need to know how to properly, get wedges and apply levers before you can worry about like all sorts of weird variations that could occur from there.
Yeah, I think I could be wrong, but I think Josh quotes a famous French composer. I believe his name is Claude Debussy. I'm totally butchering that. But it's basically, the quote is, and I really like this quote, music is the space between the notes.
I knew you were going to say that quote.
And it's an awesome quote because the way that I sort of take that quote in is like I'm an instructor, so when I have a bunch of people that want to learn leg locks, I have a room full of maybe 20 people, and some of them are good at leg locks, some of them are not that great. They're still sort of putting together an understanding, and then some really don't really know anything, right? So and I have quite a bit of knowledge on leg locks, so and I want to share that knowledge with them. I want them to get it all as quick as I can, but I have to be disciplined because I know that if I try and give them all the knowledge at once, that I'm only going to muddle the lesson. So what's more important is that I actually make smaller circles. I take things away, and this is a constant battle for instructors to actually show less.
It's hard to watch someone do something wrong because your initial thought is, I want to just bombard them with a list of every little thing they could be doing better, but that's not how people learn, right?
That's right. And when I remember when I first started teaching around purple belt level, I would do that. I would see things wrong and I'd correct everything. I'd be like, no, you got to do this. No, you got to do this. You got to do this. And then I realized I'm like, actually, I'm denying them the experience of getting something wrong, realizing that they did it wrong, and then making adjustments on their own.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to give them all of the feedback all at once. I'm trying to give them all the information all at once. And this actually happens a lot when you're teaching kids because, kids have an even shorter attention span and memory span, and a lot of the times don't even want to be there. So it's hard to strip things to the very bare minimum concepts to give them. But if I have, like, let's say we're doing a heel hook from the 411 and I have a room that has in a perfect world, everyone would be high level, but that's just not the case when you're running a business, right? So I have to first explain what position we're in. I have to explain what wedges are going to control, let's say it's a 411, what wedges are going to keep me in this position. And also how am I going to, what's my goal? Once I get that position, a lot of people don't even know what to do next. Well, I'm looking for heel exposure generally. I'm looking for my digging mechanics. Yeah. And all the while, I have to keep my wedging mechanics strong or else I'm going to lose that whole position entirely, right? I need to control the free leg for as long as I can so that the heel hook can become a possibility and my opponent doesn't spin out and get into base. So, understanding the real reasons why techniques work and breaking things down to a smaller level, it really helps people understand in a classroom setting, but also as an instructor, I find that it really will help you teach things a lot better and will help you provide the most essential information possible when you're teaching something.
Yeah, you have to, and I really like the way that you explained this. You're denying people the opportunity to learn from failure. And that is so important with good instructors. You can't just tell people what to do.
Yeah.
They have to reason it out themselves, right? It's kind of like Socratic learning with the body. You have to let the person reach the conclusion on their own. And the only way they can do that is by hitting those walls during training or while trying a move. I remember one time I was doing a private with my coach, and I was stuck in mount, and he was just sitting there, and I was just getting crushed with pressure. And I just for like 5 minutes, I'm trying to escape and nothing is working. And then eventually I say, okay, I can't get out. Like, what am I doing wrong? And he says, well, why didn't you ask me that 5 minutes ago? Like, I've been waiting for you to ask me that. And then we go into this whole discussion. So he's waiting for me to get to the point where I'm ready for that next bit of knowledge.
Yeah.
And that's what incremental learning is all about. And that's what Josh is talking about when he's talking about making smaller circles. Like, you can't worry about the intricate details and the what ifs if someone doesn't understand the foundations. This is something that, hits close to home for me because until recently, there were certain moves that I wasn't able to do effectively. Like I would always lose, even basic things like mounted arm bars because there were certain fundamental things I didn't understand. I was just trying to go through the steps of doing an armbar, but I was actually not being as effective with positional dominance as I should have been. And as a result, people can spin out of it quite easily, right? So it's a really valid learning technique to kind of focus on, think of the day one stuff and don't worry about the day two stuff until you've mastered the day one stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as an instructor, I always encourage questions, and I encourage people that, a lot of the times when I'm teaching something like a heel hook from 411, there's a good majority of the class that does understand that. Mm-hmm. So they'll come up after and they'll say, hey, what about this variation? What about this? What if my opponent does this? So obviously, be ready for those questions too, and be ready to give that instruction for those who want that instruction. It's just that sometimes we got to make things a little bit more simple just so that it can reach the entire room and everyone can be on a level playing field. You can always add to it, but if you give it all at once, sometimes, it's going to actually start working in reverse.
Yeah. What's interesting too is that one of the things that this kind of sounds like in a lot of ways, the flip side of this is, you need to be ready to absorb that information. On one hand, you can have very junior people who are actively asking you for this information, but against more senior people, there's always more you can learn. And it takes a level of expertise and humility really to, when you become that senior, to actually still ask for this information like you're a beginner. Ask, why isn't this working? And something that, Josh actually has, I believe, a chapter in the book that he calls Beginner's Mind, which again is a mental model that we keep talking about. And I hate to harp on it once again, but it's so fundamental if you want to succeed at anything in life, but especially if you want to have quicker success than you otherwise could. You need to put that ego aside and be willing to ask for this information when you need it and when you hit walls. You don't want to get frustrated when something's not working. You don't want to get mad at yourself. You just want to, be just innocently ask and see if you can get the answer to why what you're trying to do is not working.
Yeah, and being humble is really important too, because being humble, you will have that mindfulness that, hey, I don't know everything, and it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to still have that beginner's mind, and to not, strut around like you know everything and you're the shining example for everyone to follow. Being humble will pay off in a lot of different ways. Not only will people see your humbleness and they'll respect the fact that you're humble, but you'll get a lot more out of it because you will be much more open to absorb a lot more information. So that's where that beginner's mind really comes into play.
Yeah. So, we've talked quite a bit about the art of learning. I hope that this has inspired you to pick up the book. I listened to the Audible version. It's fantastic. There's a lot of different ways that you can engage this content. Of course, you can get it on Amazon. Josh also has a website where he's documented kind of the key learning concepts and sort of structures behind the book. So there's a lot of material out there. I really do encourage people, especially who are interested in the learning side of things when dealing with jiu-jitsu, to pick it up and give it a go. Do let us know what you think of it. And also do let us know if this type of episode is something that you found interesting, because we can always do more like this in the future. So getting into questions, Matt, kind of an oddball question came up that I've been sitting in the queue for a while, and I thought it would be good to get at it. We were asked to provide anecdotes about specific memories we have, either tournament, class, or just a moment that relates to our jiu-jitsu journey. You want to go first?
I mean, I did provide a few tonight. Let's see, about the book that we talked about tonight.
I think just about in general, but we could also be specifically about the book. For me, I think one of the things that I always tell as kind of an interesting story is just when it comes to my personal jiu-jitsu journey. You know, I got into jiu-jitsu mostly because I was interested in self-defense and because I find going to the gym to be boring. So I was looking for kind of a more engaging way to get my exercise. And what's interesting is that self-defense is like the one thing I've never actually needed to use jiu-jitsu for.
Yeah.
But
you and everyone else.
Yeah, basically. But you get a lot out of it in other ways. You know, there were certain things that I didn't expect from jiu-jitsu. Like, I met my wife through jiu-jitsu. I wouldn't have my wife and my family and my kid if not for jiu-jitsu. Of course, Matt, you and I spend a lot more time together than we used to because we now have this hobby that eats up so much of our time. Mm-hmm. There's also other little weird, odd benefits to jiu-jitsu, like the fact that like a lot of my coworkers and even like very, very like high-ranking people at companies that I've worked for train jiu-jitsu. So it's kind of given me this interesting opportunity to meet people and work with people in a way that I wouldn't normally have expected. And of course, this podcast has been a super fun passion project where it allows me to kind of really sit down and actually actively think about the stuff that I do on the mats. And it's kind of an interesting reflection exercise because when you train, thousands and thousands of times, it gets to the point where you're not really kind of thinking about what you're doing when you're doing it. That's actually what you're trying to achieve with jiu-jitsu, right? You're trying to drill things so much that you don't need to think because, as Salo Ribeiro says, if you have to think, you die. You need to be able to just pull these things off. But it's proven to be really helpful too, to kind of turn the clock back. And now that I've kind of done all of this, to actually reflect and think about how all of these things that we do fit together and how they work and how they tie into the stuff that other people are researching, like what Rob's doing, right? And to kind of see the common threads between this and the stuff that people at other gyms do. And it gives me kind of a critical eye too, because, when I look at techniques now, I kind of look at them through our framework and through the framework of alignment and just all of this literature out there, and I try to kind of like assess whether this technique is fundamentally sound, and that's kind of a level of thinking that I didn't have before. I used to just look at techniques and be like, I either like it or I don't. But now I have a much more reasoned argument as to why I like it or I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just share sort of, I guess, not really my story, but just looking back on where my life was going before I started jiu-jitsu, I was preparing to basically become a world-class chef, and I was gonna follow that as much as I could because I was passionate about it and because I was good at it and I wanted it. And then the more that I got into it, the more I realized, hey, this is going to have a huge toll on my family life. And it's funny how things change when you're young. Certain things don't matter as much when you're young. And then when you get older, you realize, oh yeah, like I want to have a family. I want to have weekends off. I want to, have luxuries like not commuting an hour to and from work, and I don't want to work holidays all the time and things like that. And those things don't seem to matter when you're a young man and you're looking for a job. Yeah.
Like you're trying to make a name for yourself, so you're willing to sacrifice a bit to get there, right?
Exactly. And I was setting up my future to be in an industry that was just based around sacrifice, basically, and for not a lot of gain. I remember when I first started jiu-jitsu, I actually was going to go to the school that you were training at, and I had no aspirations to be a competitor. Like I remember I was talking to someone at the front desk, and I said, "Hey, like my brother trains here. I'm here to try a class, and I'm interested in maybe training like once a week or something." And they actually turned me away. They said, well, no,
really?
Yeah. They said we're actually looking for more commitment than once a week. We don't have any plans like that. I said, oh, okay. So I went to a different school. And where that led me was to train with some really good guys, but then that fell apart and everyone left that school, which led me to another school, where I made a lot of great friends. I started networking in the community, started competing a lot more. And before I knew it, I was actually like training every night. I was starting to teach, and I was meeting a lot of people in the community that I never would have met if I had, stuck with that first gym or whatever. And then I met Coach Rob through that gym. And now looking back, I think, wow, if I never made the decision to compete, I would never have a portfolio, and I would never have like a reputation as a competitor, which it's really helped me as a gym owner now, because people can access my matches and look up my history. And also just the people that I've met and the networks that I've met by going through this weird journey through jiu-jitsu. You never know where you're going to be. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, if you're wondering what you should be doing in life, and you're wondering which direction you should go, I don't always recommend going towards the money, and I don't always recommend going towards the sacrifice, because I used to think as a cook that, when the more work that I put in, it's all going to pay off. It's all going to pay off. The fact is that that's not true. Sometimes you put in a lot of work, you'll sacrifice a lot, and it's never going to pay off. What worked for me was I found something that I liked and that I wanted to do and I was passionate about. And then I just followed that passion. And eventually that passion turned into jiu-jitsu. And I just kept following that passion and trying to make that my life. And then throughout the journeys, just, trying to find the best people to train with. I'm here, and I have a business that basically supports itself now. And I feel like I'm the luckiest guy ever. So, if you can identify the passion that something that you love to do and find a way to monetize it, that's going to be, I think, the best route to go. I don't necessarily think that, just because you're working 10 hours a day or whatever means you're going to get the results that you want. Be very selective, because ultimately I think time and health are way more important than, and of course family are way more important than things like money, because once you have enough money to support yourself and your family, you can't really take it with you. It's not really as important as those things. So that's just my little, for people out there. And definitely if you are passionate about jiu-jitsu and you want to have a gym one day, it's possible. Just do your training every day, have a beginner's mind, and always try and train with the best people you can, and never avoid the easy roles.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Matt. We covered quite a bit today. Just to quickly kind of recap some of the mental models that we talked about. We talked about how it's critical to respect people, not the positions they occupy, not to get overly focused on, what the quality of a professor based solely on their championships or their rank or their level of fame. We talked about having a growth mindset, always looking to improve and not getting caught up in your ego and how big or how good you think you are. We talked about doing what works, regardless of whether it's considered, popular or what your instructor thinks about it. If it works and it's fundamentally sound, you can justify it from an alignment standpoint, then do it. We talked about extreme ownership, taking ownership of aspects of your life, regardless of whether they're your responsibility or not. We talked about mindfulness, being being aware of the present moment and being aware of essentially eventually overcoming the obstacles put in front of you by your mind. We talked about flow state and triggers to get into flow state. We talked about investing in loss. We talked about growth from discomfort, which is kind of another part of that. We talked about form to leave form, meaning drilling things until you can do them at a subconscious and muscle memory level. We talked about incremental learning, meaning that you can't learn everything all at once. And as a good instructor, you need to understand that and give people what they need right now. We talked about making smaller circles, which is related to that, meaning distilling down and focusing on the core fundamentals and mastering those before you then broaden your knowledge. And finally, we talked about beginner's mind, meaning, always attacking every situation with the humility and mindset of a total beginner. So I think that wraps it, Matt. Any closing thoughts you want to cover on the topic of the art of learning?
No, it's I think we covered it really great. That's a great book, guys. Definitely check it out. Again, my only criticism is I wish you talked more about jiu-jitsu, but it's still, there's a lot to learn from his experiences. And I found the chess portion
Oddly relevant.
really relevant and really entertaining.
Yeah.
Again, just like you, I listened to it on Audible, and I think that's a great way to read because, you can get a lot done while you're listening to books. Definitely check that book out, guys. And thank you for the support, and keep the questions coming, and we hope you enjoyed the chat today.
Thank you. Bye.